Welcome to Real Police Stories. Real stories of crimes and criminals that you wouldn't believe. Names are changed, but the events are true. Subscribe for more amazing stories like this one. Now for today's story. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not under fluorescent lights. Not between laminated menus. Not sitting quietly in a booth, while the rest of the room carried on as if nothing was wrong. Yet there she was. A little girl sat inside a Denny's restaurant in Coeur, Idaho, her feet dangling beneath the table. Across from her sat an older man, tall, thin, watching the room without really looking at anyone. For most people, it was just another late meal. For two customers, it felt like time stopped, because they had seen her face before. Not in person. In print. On a missing child flyer. One customer picked up the phone. Another followed. Within minutes, two separate 911 calls described the same impossible sight. A child who vanished weeks earlier, sitting in public alive. Police were dispatched immediately. And as officers quietly entered the restaurant, they had no idea that this moment, this ordinary booth in an ordinary diner, was about to pull them back into a case they thought had already reached its darkest point. They were wrong, because this story didn't begin at Denny. It began weeks earlier, on a rainy morning, with a truck no one recognized. May 16, 2005. In Kootenai County, Idaho, rain fell steadily over dense trees and dirt roads, the kind of rain locals barely notice anymore. That morning, a homeowner stepped outside and saw something that didn't belong. A white pickup truck sat parked on his property. He didn't recognize it, didn't know who it belonged to, and no one had asked permission to leave it there. At first it didn't feel urgent, just strange. Still, he called 911. He described the vehicle, its location, and what little he could see inside. The front seat held a small toolbox and an axe. Hours later, the same man made a second call. This time, his voice had changed. He explained that he'd gone to a nearby rental house on his property, one occupied by a family he knew casually. He knocked on the door. No answer. But something else caught his eye. Blood. On the door. Across the frame. Too much to ignore. Deputies were sent immediately to a rural residence near Wolf Lodge, Idaho. What they were walking into, no one was prepared for. Deputies turned off the main road and followed a narrow dirt driveway toward the house near Wolf Lodge. The rain hadn't let up. It pressed down on the trees, the ground, the silence. Before reaching the front door, something caught their attention. A vehicle parked nearby. Inside, officers could see a rifle resting on the seat. The rear windows showed damage that didn't match an accident. They stepped closer. That's when they saw the stains near the entrance. Dark marks on the door. More on the ground, mixing with rainwater. Deputies knocked, then pounded. They announced themselves. No answer. Only the sound of dogs barking from inside. They moved to the back of the house. The door there wasn't locked. It was slightly open. Officers entered cautiously, securing a frightened dog near the doorway. Another animal remained hidden deeper inside, trembling. Inside the home, the air felt wrong. Still, heavy. In the kitchen, an officer stopped. On the floor lay a teenage boy. Bound. Unmoving. A few steps away, another body, an adult woman. Further inside the living room, a third. An adult man. All three were deceased. The house was searched room by room. No signs of forced entry. No one else inside. But something didn't add up. There were children's belongings everywhere. Shoes by the door. Toys. Small clothes folded and waiting. 2 children were missing. The victims were identified as members of the same household. Laura Hale, the mother. Eric Hale, her partner. Nathan Hale, her teenage son. But Laura had 2 younger children. Caleb, 9 years old. Maya, 8. They were nowhere to be found. At first, investigators considered the possibility that the children had been staying with friends or relatives. Welfare checks at this home weren't uncommon. People came and went. But that theory collapsed later that night. Detectives received a call from the children's biological father. He was frantic. He told them all 3 children were supposed to be home that night. That meant only one thing. Caleb and Maya didn't leave on their own. They were taken. Just after midnight, authorities issued an Amber Alert. Search teams flooded the area. Woodlands, fields, roads leading away from the property. Rain gave way to daylight, revealing more of the scene inside the house, details that painted a story no one wanted to imagine. Investigators followed traces through hallways and rooms. Signs of movement. Signs of fear. Signs that at least one person had survived longer than anyone realized. But there was no sign of the children. The case shifted again. This was no longer just a homicide investigation. It was now a manhunt. And somewhere out there, 2 children were with someone capable of what had just been discovered. With the Amber Alert issued, the quiet corners of North Idaho filled with noise. Sirens, search dogs, helicopters slicing through low clouds. Photos of Caleb Hale and Maya Hale appeared on television screens across the country. Their faces stared out from store windows, gas stations, highway signs. 2 children. Last seen at home. Taken by someone no one had identified. Law enforcement expanded the search radius hour by hour. Fields were combed. Trails followed. Cabins checked. But days passed with no sign of them. The case became national news. Reporters stood outside the Wolf Lodge property, speaking in hushed tones. Experts speculated. Former profilers analyzed what little information was public. Was this a robbery gone wrong? A targeted abduction? Someone the family knew? Investigators couldn't say. What they could say was unsettling. There was no forced entry. No random chaos. Everything about the scene suggested intention. Someone had come prepared. As the search stretched into weeks, hope began to erode. The children's father gave interviews pleading directly into the camera. He asked for answers, for mercy, for his children to be returned, no questions asked. Behind the scenes, investigators followed every lead. Sightings, anonymous tips, vehicles reported hundreds of miles away. Each one led nowhere. At one point, even a psychic was consulted. Nothing came of it. And with each passing day, the question grew heavier. If the children were alive, why hadn't anyone seen them? What authorities didn't know, what they couldn't know yet, was that the case had already moved far beyond Idaho. Beyond familiar roads. Beyond cell towers. Into places few people ever went. Forests, mountains, temporary camps hidden from view. And in one of those places, the truth about what happened that night was waiting. Silent, patient, until one small mistake brought everything crashing back into the open. By the time daylight crept over the riverbanks, investigators had one certainty. Whatever happened here did not happen by accident. The location mattered. This stretch of the river had a history, quiet, isolated, rarely visited unless you already knew it was there. It wasn't the kind of place someone stumbled into by chance. And then there was Caleb Moore. Caleb lived less than 15 minutes from the river. Friends described him as unpredictable, intense on a good day, volatile on a bad one. He knew the area well, too well. He'd been seen near the river more than once in the past, sometimes late at night, sometimes alone. When detectives first spoke to him, he didn't look surprised. In fact, he looked almost relieved. He told them he hadn't slept, that he'd been thinking all night, that something felt wrong, but he couldn't explain why. Then came the statement that froze the room. "I think I might have done something." The words landed heavy, not a confession, but not a denial either. Detectives pressed gently at first, letting silence do the work. Caleb shifted in his seat, rubbing his hands together, his story beginning to fracture at the edges. He claimed he'd gone to the river alone. Then he said someone else was there. Then he said he couldn't remember who suggested going. Each version contradicted the last. And yet, there was something even more unsettling than the inconsistencies. Caleb wasn't asking what happened. He wasn't asking who was hurt. He wasn't asking if anyone was dead. It was as if he already knew. As the interview continued, investigators realized they weren't just dealing with a witness. They were dealing with a man unraveling in real time. And somewhere between his pauses, his half-sentences, and his nervous laughter, a disturbing possibility began to take shape. The river wasn't the start of this story. It was the end. The interview room was small. Too small for the weight of what sat between them. Detectives let Caleb talk. They didn't interrupt when he drifted off topic. They didn't correct him when he contradicted himself. They simply listened, waiting for the moment when truth slips out by accident. That moment came when one detective asked a simple question. "Did you see anything unusual near the river?" Caleb nodded immediately. Too quickly. He described the water first, how dark it looked, how still. Then the trees. Then the smell. And then, without being prompted, he mentioned the shoe. Not just a shoe. The shoe. The problem was simple and devastating. At that point in the investigation, the discovery of the shoe had not been released to the public. It hadn't been mentioned in any news report. It hadn't been discussed outside the investigation team. Caleb had no legitimate reason to know it existed. The room went quiet. Detectives exchanged a glance that said everything. They didn't accuse him. They didn't raise their voices. They let the silence stretch, heavy and deliberate. Caleb noticed. His breathing changed. His foot began to tap against the floor. He asked for water, then didn't touch it when it arrived. When pressed on how he knew about the shoe, his explanation unraveled almost immediately. He said someone told him. Then he said he overheard it. Then he said maybe he was just imagining things. But imagination doesn't leave details behind. As the interview continued, detectives began laying out a timeline, slowly, carefully, placing Caleb closer and closer to the river at the exact window investigators believed everything went wrong. Each detail boxed him in. By the end of the session, Caleb wasn't denying involvement anymore. He was questioning his own memory. "What if I don't remember doing it?" he asked. "What if I just snapped?" For the detectives, that question mattered more than any confession. Because if Caleb didn't remember, it meant whatever happened wasn't impulsive panic. It meant something darker, something buried. And as they prepared to end the interview, one investigator made a quiet note in the file. Subject displays knowledge of crime scene details not publicly known. From that moment on, Caleb Moore was no longer just a person of interest. He was the center of the storm. While Caleb sat in an interview room replaying fragments of his own memory, a separate team returned to the river. Daylight changed everything. What looked random in the dark now felt deliberate. The distance between objects, the placement, the absence of drag marks where there should have been some. This wasn't chaos. It was staging. Search teams widened the perimeter, moving beyond the initial discovery point into brush that showed signs of recent disturbance. Broken twigs, flattened grass, a trail that didn't follow the river's natural flow but cut across it. Someone had moved through here with purpose. And then they found something else. Not large, not obvious, but impossible to ignore once seen. A second set of impressions near the water's edge. Different size, different pattern. Two people had been here. That realization shifted everything. Up until now, investigators had been building a case around one unstable individual, someone capable of acting alone, but the ground told a different story, one that suggested coordination, or at least company. Back at the station, detectives revisited Caleb's interview. The moments where he hesitated. The times he said, "we," before correcting himself. The long pauses whenever questions drifted toward who else might have been nearby. Those weren't mistakes. They were leaks. Phone records added another layer. Calls made late that night. One number appeared repeatedly, short calls, unanswered attempts, then silence. When detectives traced the number, it led to someone Caleb knew well. Someone who lived even closer to the river. Someone who hadn't come forward. Yet, the case was no longer about if Caleb was involved. It was about how much he was hiding and whether he was protecting himself or someone else. And as the pieces began to align, investigators faced a troubling possibility. The most dangerous person in this case might not be the one sitting in the interview room. The second interview didn't happen right away. Detectives waited. They let the pressure build in the quiet space between questions and answers, between what Caleb had said and what the evidence was now beginning to suggest. When they finally brought him back in, the room felt different. There was a second chair this time. Empty, but noticeable. Caleb noticed it immediately. He asked who it was for. No one answered. Instead, detectives began again, slowly retracing the night, asking the same questions in slightly different ways. Where he went, who he spoke to, why he kept circling back to the river in his story even when no one mentioned it. This time, Caleb didn't resist. He looked tired, smaller, like someone who'd been carrying weight longer than he could handle. When detectives brought up the phone records, his eyes dropped to the table. When they mentioned the repeated calls, the unanswered ones, his jaw tightened. They didn't say the name. They didn't have to. Caleb exhaled, long and shaky. "I didn't go there alone," he said. The words hung in the air. He explained it carefully at first, how it wasn't supposed to turn into anything serious, how it was just a conversation, just meeting up, just trying to figure things out. He framed it like a bad decision that spiraled, not something planned. But when detectives asked why evidence suggested movement after the fact, why things appeared placed, not left, his story began to fracture again. That's when the silence returned. Longer this time. Caleb rubbed his face, then looked up, eyes glassy. "I panicked," he said. "And I wasn't the only one." That was the moment the empty chair stopped being symbolic. There was someone else out there, someone who knew exactly what happened and had chosen to stay quiet, someone who hadn't been losing sleep, someone who hadn't come close to confessing. As the interview ended, detectives stepped out of the room with a new understanding. Caleb wasn't the architect of what happened. He was the weak point, and the person he'd been calling. They were about to get a knock on the door. The knock came just after dusk. The house sat less than a mile from the river, close enough to hear it on quiet nights, close enough to know when the water level changed. The person who answered the door was Evan Brooks. He didn't look surprised. That was the first problem. Detectives introduced themselves, explained why they were there, and watched his face carefully. No sharp inhale, no widened eyes, no instinctive question of why. Just a nod. "Yeah," he said, "I figured you show up." Inside, the house was neat, almost deliberately so, nothing out of place, no signs of a rushed exit or a restless night. Evan offered them a seat, then sat across from them with his hands folded calmly in his lap. Too calmly. He confirmed what phone records already showed. Yes, Caleb had called him that night. Yes, they'd spoken. Yes, they'd met near the river. But when asked what happened next, Evan's answers were polished. Too linear. Too complete. Like something rehearsed. He described the night without hesitation, without gaps, without the kind of uncertainty that usually comes from shock or fear. Where Caleb stumbled over his own memories, Evan moved straight through them. And then he said something that made one detective stop taking notes. "I left before anything happened." The statement was clean, convenient. But it conflicted with the evidence. With the footprints. With the timeline. With Caleb's insistence that he hadn't been alone when things went wrong. When confronted gently with those inconsistencies, Evan didn't get defensive. He smiled. Not wide. Not friendly. Just enough. "People remember things differently," he said, "especially when they're under stress." That answer didn't sound like someone trying to help. It sounded like someone explaining away the truth. As the interview wrapped up, detectives walked out knowing one thing for certain. Evan Brooks wasn't panicking because he believed he'd outsmarted the moment. And people who believe that are often the most dangerous ones in the room. The river ran dark and slow that night, reflecting nothing but the faint glow of distant streetlights. Detectives returned to the riverbank the next morning, boots sinking into wet mud, flashlights cutting through the mist. They traced a path along the edge where Caleb and Evan claimed to have met. Everything seemed ordinary at first, until they found it. A single footprint. Small, flat, pressed into the mud as if the person had paused, balanced on the edge, waiting. And then another, larger, wider, the kind of print made by someone wearing heavy boots, someone who moved with purpose, not hesitation. The pattern of movement told a story Caleb and Evan hadn't shared. Someone had been dragging something, or someone, along the bank. The prints disappeared into the shadows of overgrown reeds, then reappeared closer to the water, alongside a dark smear that didn't belong. A mistake, small, tiny, but enough. The river had remembered what the witnesses hadn't. For the first time, detectives began piecing together the timeline with absolute clarity. Caleb hadn't acted alone, and Evan's calmness, it wasn't innocence, it was complicity. The river, quiet and unyielding, had kept the secret that night, and now it had given them a clue. By the end of the morning, they had enough evidence to know the unthinkable. The truth about what had started as a seemingly minor incident at the river would unravel everything, connecting both men to a series of choices and actions that had left scars far deeper than anyone had imagined. And far from over, the case was about to plunge even darker, into the calculated horror neither of them had expected to be discovered. Weeks later, a team of investigators made their way into the dense woods of northern Montana. The trees were thick, the undergrowth tangled, and the air hung heavy with the scent of moss and decay. They were following a lead, an abandoned cabin that local residents claimed had been used by transient hunters, maybe even squatters. What they found stopped them cold. The cabin was intact but eerily silent. The door creaked on its hinges, and the smell of smoke lingered, stale and acrid. Inside, the investigators discovered signs of recent occupation, camping gear scattered across the floor, small footprints in the dust, and a series of crude rope bindings hanging from the rafters. It was more than a hideout, it was a trap. In one corner, a crude sleeping area had been set up with blankets and tarps. Nearby, scorched marks on the wooden floor suggested something had been burned, trash perhaps, or something far more sinister. Investigators found evidence that unnerved them: duct tape, zip ties, and a handsaw, all meticulously placed as if ready for immediate use. Every item told the same story. Someone had been prepared for violence. And then they found it, the digital camera. Inside the camera were videos. At first, nothing seemed unusual: campfires, outdoor scenery, quiet moments. But as the footage played, the truth unfolded in horrifying clarity. One by one, the videos documented the terror inside the cabin. The motions, the cries, the fear of unseen victims. The camera had captured the unimaginable, frozen in time, a visual record of cruelty. For the detectives, it wasn't just evidence. It was confirmation. The nightmare they'd suspected was real, and the scope of it was worse than anyone could have imagined. And far from ending here, the cabin in the woods was only the beginning of the revelations yet to come. Somewhere beyond these trees, the next chapter of the horror was waiting to be unearthed. It was July 2nd, nearly 2 months after the murders at Wolf Lodge. The tension in Coeur d'Alene was unbearable. Every parent, every officer, every neighbor feared the worst for the missing children, Shasta and Dylan. Then came the call. A manager at a Denny's restaurant had spotted a little girl sitting with a tall, unfamiliar man. Something about her struck him as familiar, eerily familiar. He glanced at the missing person flyers still plastered in town. His stomach dropped. Could it be? The dispatcher acted immediately, sending officers to table 20. When the detectives arrived, the man was identified as 42-year-old Joseph Harding, already a known violent offender with a history of assaults and abductions dating back decades. His criminal record was extensive, terrifying in its breadth, and chilling in its implications. And the little girl with him was Shasta, alive but visibly traumatized, holding onto memories that no child should ever carry. Shasta's first words to authorities were almost unbelievable in their gravity. She recounted with clarity the horrors of that night at Wolf Lodge, how her family had been bound, held at gunpoint, and murdered by a stranger, Joseph Harding, someone she had never met before. How she and Dylan had been forced into a stolen vehicle, driven into the wilderness, chained to trees, and subjected to threats and terror. For the first time, investigators heard Shasta's story directly from the source. Every detail, every fear, every moment of unimaginable pain painted a picture of calculated depravity that went far beyond a simple home invasion. And yet, amidst the horror, one fact remained stark: Shasta had survived. Her courage and will to live had brought authorities to the doorstep of the man responsible for one of the most twisted series of crimes the region had ever seen. As the officers prepared to take Joseph into custody, they realized this was only the beginning. The truth about the night at Wolf Lodge, and what Joseph had done to Dylan, was far darker than anyone could have anticipated. After Shasta was safely in the hands of authorities, the full weight of her story began to emerge. She spoke quietly, deliberately, recounting the journey into the remote Montana wilderness. Joseph Harding had driven her and Dylan to isolated campsites, far from the eyes of civilization. There, the children were chained to trees, forced to remain still for hours at a time while Joseph conducted his sinister business. Small pills were added to their water, and every day brought new rules, new threats, new terror. Shasta described how they were made to write letters to their father, letters filled with false hope, promises that they might see their family again. Dylan's handwriting was steady despite the fear, telling their father they were alive, that they knew what had happened to their mother. But the horror did not end there. On one occasion, Joseph left Shasta chained to a tree while he took Dylan to a distant location. When he returned, Dylan was injured. Later, Shasta witnessed him at an abandoned cabin where Dylan was tortured for hours. Joseph even recorded these assaults on video, taunting the boy with cruel words. "The devil is here, boy. The devil himself. The devil likes to watch children suffer and cry." Shasta recounted a moment that would haunt investigators forever. Joseph's ritual was grotesque, almost ceremonial. He would sing prayers in a high, eerie voice, pause to scream at God, and then continue with his torment. The acts were deliberate, controlled, and unthinkably cruel. The culmination of this nightmare came with Dylan. Shasta described a shotgun blast, fired from close range, that killed her brother. Joseph then burned Dylan's body, leaving only ashes behind, a grim punctuation to his depravity. Through it all, Shasta survived. She remained silent when necessary, observant and careful, a child forced to grow up overnight, witnessing unimaginable evil, yet holding onto the will to live. Her account not only revealed the chilling events of that night, but also confirmed that Joseph's crimes were far from random. He was a predator with methodical precision, planning every move, leaving a trail of horror in his wake. As the investigation deepened, authorities unearthed documents and journals that painted a portrait of a man who had been dangerous long before Wolf Lodge. Among them was a personal manuscript titled Autobiography of Ed Harding, left behind by a former landlord in Fargo. Within its 101 pages, Joseph detailed his childhood, formative experiences, and early brushes with the law, each entry laced with hints of deviant desires and unsettling obsessions. During his teenage years in the 1980s, Joseph's writings revealed the emergence of an alternate persona he called Jazzy Jet. In this guise, he experimented with drag and lingerie, sharing photos online for male admirers. At first glance, this may have seemed like an eccentric teenage rebellion, but combined with his later crimes, authorities recognized a pattern of compulsive, manipulative behavior and early predatory tendencies. Joseph's criminal record began at just 15. By 17, he had been convicted of assaulting a 14-year-old boy and sentenced to 20 years in prison. After serving 14 years, he was released on parole in 1994, only to commit further offenses within a decade. In March 2005, mere months before the Wolf Lodge murders, Joseph was charged with another violent crime against 2 boys. With the help of a friend posting bail, he vanished, leaving the authorities unaware that a far more horrific plan was already forming in his mind. As detectives traced his history, they uncovered a cold case that would link him to the murder of 10-year-old Anthony Martinez in Beaumont, California, in 1997. Anthony had been abducted at knife point while playing with friends. Despite a widespread search, the boy's body was discovered nearly 2 weeks later. Bound and showing signs of assault eerily similar to the later Wolf Lodge victims. A partial fingerprint on the duct tape and a composite sketch at the time had yielded no arrests. But now, in light of Joseph's capture, law enforcement was able to confirm his involvement. Even more chilling were Joseph's confessions to 2 other murders of young girls in Seattle in July 1996, 9-year-old Carmen Cubias and 11-year-old Samieo White. Both had disappeared after leaving a motel parking lot. 17 months later, their skeletal remains were found on a muddy hillside. Authorities were initially skeptical of Joseph's claims, suspecting a pattern seen in other serial offenders who falsely confessed to crimes for notoriety. But the geographic proximity to his residence and the details he provided lent credence to the horrifying reality. He had been operating undetected for years. These revelations forced investigators to confront the terrifying breadth of Joseph Harding's actions. He was no opportunistic killer. He was a methodical predator whose crimes spanned states and decades. Each journal entry, each cold case, and each confession revealed a mind fixated on domination, cruelty, and control, a man whose darkness had remained hidden behind ordinary facades, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. After Shasta's rescue, law enforcement worked feverishly to piece together the final chapters of Joseph Harding's dark story. Armed with her testimony, surveillance footage, and physical evidence from the stolen Jeep, investigators had enough to confront him with his crimes. But the breadth and depth of his violence would continue to shock even seasoned detectives. On July 12th, Joseph was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of first-degree kidnapping, all stemming from the Wolf Lodge tragedy. Within a week, he confessed to the murder of Anthony Martinez, adding a decades-old cold case to the growing list of horrors. Authorities had finally linked a pattern of lethal predation spanning multiple states, years, and victims, cementing Joseph's status as a serial offender of unparalleled brutality. The confessions did not end there. During subsequent interrogations, Joseph claimed responsibility for the Seattle murders of Carmen Cubias and Samuel White in 1996. While law enforcement could not definitively prosecute due to insufficient evidence, his chilling descriptions aligned with the circumstances of their deaths. Each confession revealed not only the meticulous planning of his crimes, but also the disturbing pleasure he derived from control and terror. Court proceedings for the Wolf Lodge murders began with a level of intensity rarely seen in Kootenai County. Joseph entered the courtroom wearing a bulletproof vest, a grim reminder of the notoriety he had earned. The prosecution painted a stark, horrifying portrait, a man who had methodically stalked his victims, manipulated families, and executed a series of murders with calculated efficiency. Each piece of evidence, from duct tape and zip ties to video recordings and journals, was presented to demonstrate the cold, premeditated nature of his actions. The defense, unable to deny the overwhelming evidence, could only attempt to humanize Joseph, highlighting his troubled upbringing and psychological history. Yet, for the families of the victims and the broader community, these arguments offered little solace. The jurors, like the public, were forced to grapple with the incomprehensible reality of a man who had methodically destroyed lives over decades. On October 16, 2006, Joseph entered a guilty plea to the murder and kidnapping charges. He was immediately sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, a legal acknowledgement of the magnitude of his crimes. But the judicial process did not end there. In August 2008, a federal grand jury recommended the death penalty, underscoring the gravity of his actions. In the following years, he received additional life sentences for Anthony Martinez's murder and other confirmed offenses, ensuring he would never again pose a threat to society. Despite the legal closure, the psychological toll on investigators, survivors, and families was profound. They had faced a criminal mind that combined meticulous planning with unspeakable cruelty. Joseph's journals, confessions, and interviews revealed a man who did not merely commit murder in a fit of rage. He studied it, planned it, and rationalized it as a form of societal justice twisted by his own delusions. By April 5, 2011, after all proceedings, Joseph Harding had been sentenced to multiple life terms for his confirmed murders. Yet the shadow of his actions continued to loom. Even after decades of evading justice, he had left indelible scars, traumatized survivors, destroyed families, and a community forced to confront the existence of a darkness they had only glimpsed in nightmares. Finally, on March 28, 2021, Joseph Harding died in prison from a terminal brain tumor. The man who had haunted the Pacific Northwest and beyond for decades met an end, but the echoes of his actions would forever remain, a chilling reminder of the depths of human depravity and the fragile line between ordinary life and unimaginable horror. Even after Joseph Harding was behind bars, the echoes of his crimes continued to reverberate across Coeur d'Alene, Kootenai County, and beyond. The Wolf Lodge murders, which had begun as an ordinary May day in 2005, became a lasting scar on the community's psyche, a grim reminder of how evil can infiltrate the most ordinary spaces. Shasta, the sole surviving child from that night, became the focal point of both hope and tragedy. Rescued from Joseph's grasp, she bore the heavy burden of memory, vivid recollections of her family's last moments, the chilling sights of blood-stained floors, the sounds of desperate cries, and the knowledge that her brother Dylan had been killed before her eyes. Her survival was nothing short of a miracle, yet it came at a cost. Trauma etched itself into her young mind, leaving scars that would not heal quickly, if ever fully. Psychologists working with her noted the lingering symptoms of PTSD, nightmares, hypervigilance, and a constant fear that the world could harbor the same evil she had survived. The families of the other victims, Brenda, Mark, and Slade, were left to navigate an unbearable grief. Funerals were somber, community vigils were held, but no ceremony could undo the horror or bring back the loved ones who had been brutally torn from their lives. Friends, neighbors, and even local law enforcement who had first responded to the scene carried the weight of the images they had witnessed. The blood-soaked carpet, the shattered glass, the brutal aftermath of the hammer attacks, and the chilling realization of just how calculated Harding's violence had been. Authorities described the Wolf Lodge home as a crime scene unlike any they had ever encountered. Every detail, from the scattered duct tape to the blood trails across hallways, spoke to a level of meticulous planning and sadistic intent rarely seen outside of fiction. Investigators often returned in their minds to the moment they saw Shasta alive, a small figure wrapped in terror but remarkably resilient, juxtaposed against the finality of the others' fates. It was both a victory and a haunting reminder of what had been lost. Joseph Harding's digital footprint added another layer of horror. His online journals, videos, and photographs revealed a mind obsessed not only with murder but with control, domination, and the documentation of his own depravity. The Fifth Nail, his encrypted journal, became a case study in criminal psychology, a window into the rationalizations, delusions, and carefully constructed self-narratives of a serial predator. To experts, his writings demonstrated a chilling mix of intellect, manipulation, and moral detachment, showing how someone could commit such atrocities while framing them as a twisted form of justice or societal punishment. The broader community grappled with shock, disbelief, and the urgent question of how such evil could exist unnoticed. Parents became hyper-aware, neighbors more vigilant, and law enforcement agencies reviewed their protocols for child welfare and rural surveillance. Schools, local businesses, and public spaces carried an invisible tension, a collective awareness that even the quietest neighborhoods were not immune to danger. For Shasta, the path forward was uncertain and fragile. With therapy, family support, and community outreach, she slowly began to reclaim a sense of safety. Yet even as she grew, the memories of Joseph Harding's cruelty were never far from her mind. Each anniversary of that night, each news report of violent crime, reopened the wounds that had been inflicted years before. Her resilience became a symbol, not just of survival, but of the enduring human capacity to face darkness and continue living. Joseph Harding's death in 2021 closed a chapter in legal terms, but the shadow of his actions remains. Investigators, survivors, and families carry the weight of his crimes as both a cautionary tale and a permanent reminder. Evil can wear a familiar face, operate in plain sight, and leave devastation in its wake. Yet in the midst of horror, the glimmer of survival, the life of Shasta, the relentless pursuit of justice, and the community's response, stands as a testament to endurance, courage, and the faint but unyielding hope that even in darkness, light can prevail. In the end, the story of Joseph Harding and the Wolf Lodge murders is more than a case file. It is a warning, a psychological study, and a chronicle of human tragedy. It reminds us that vigilance, compassion, and the protection of the innocent are never optional, and that even the smallest act, like a Denny's manager noticing a familiar face, can become the turning point between life and death. YouTube says you'll like this next story. Click on it to continue the journey into real police stories.